The American language may have been a band of national union, but it was also a mark of individual identity. In my previous lectures, I tried to call attention to some of the ways in which writers and thinkers in the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries associated distinctive forms of American English with features of American cultural and social experience. And I also looked in my last lecture at Jefferson and Lincoln as figures of great public oratory who went back to the past resources of the English language to give voice to national expression. In this lecture, I'd like to look at individuals, and I'd like to suggest that for American cultural and literary and linguistic history, the relationship between language and the individual is a creative one. And I mean that in several ways. Creative, obviously, in the sense of being creative as a writer or coming up with new forms of expression, but also the idea that language, in some sense, creates the self, that we become who we are through the reading and writing of texts. I'm going to look at three writers of the 19th century in particular. Frederick Douglass, the great African-American figure of political and rhetorical power and control. Walt Whitman, the Brooklyn-born bard of the American self, who gives voice to an omnivorousness of language. And Herman Melville, the novelist and traveler, who in his epic novel Moby Dick presented a worldview, if you like, of language, culture, and the imagination. American rhetoric generates an American self, but that American self goes back before the 19th century. And I'd like to review some of, if you like, the earliest origins of this relationship between language and individual identity. In the 17th and 18th centuries, some of the original settlers in the colonies, members of the Puritan sect, were fascinated by the observation of the self and the relationship between that observation and its expression in language. Central to a great deal of Puritan intellectual and literary life is the idea of introspection, the notion that reading the signs of the self will give one a sense of what will happen in this life and the next. Tales of personal experience or allegories like John Bunyan's immensely popular Pilgrim's Progress, journals and diaries, all of these are the places where the Puritan self found itself articulated in language. The education of the child was central to the Puritan experience. Hornbooks, that is, sheets with alphabets and prayers, primers, introductions to the language, and readers were all part of the Puritan home and the Puritan classroom. These alphabets were not just linguistic, but they were spiritual. Just think for a minute about what it means to live in a world in which A is for apple, where A is also for Adam, and where Adam and the apple signal that fall, where B is for Bible, where J is for Jesus, where S is for the serpent. In these alphabets and illustrative stories in these educational manuals, the learning of the letters becomes the learning of the spiritual and religious life. One of the most famous examples of this tradition is what is known as the New England Primer. It first appears at the close of the 17th century, and it was reprinted with additions and modifications almost uncountable times until the 19th. The New England Primer taught generations of Americans how to read. And in the process of learning their letters, they would learn moral and social values. Grammar became the medium of social indoctrination, and the little poems and the little allegories of the New England Primer gave to so many American students a sense that, as the Primer put it in one of its most famous poems, "Thy book and heart shall never part," that the book and the heart always go together. For Frederick Douglass, the great African-American writer and politician of the mid-19th century, the book and the heart were inseparable. But learning to read was a different story. In my previous lecture, I called attention to the way in which Douglass writes about, in his autobiography, his reading and writing through his master Tommy's Webster's Spelling Book, and how Webster had such an impact on Douglass's life. I want to recall that passage because now I want to recall exactly what it is he's learning how to do. In that passage, you'll remember that Douglass is learning how to copy out the italics of Webster's speller. Why is he focusing on the italics? I think that what Douglass wants to do is he wants to place this moment in his own life, as it were, in italics. That is, italics are a visual way of creating emphasis that's derived historically from the older humanist hands of Italy, and it was standardized in Latin print. In English printing, it came to be used to represent other languages, but also as a form of emphasis. At this moment, what Douglass does is he looks back to that history of typography to place his moment in italics, to create an illusion for the literate reader that this experience of learning how to read and write is somehow to be italicized. Throughout his writings, Frederick Douglass illustrates the texture of African American and also traditional English rhetoric throughout the 19th century. And one of the most fascinating passages that I'd like to read from is his story of the runaway slave. Now, this is a passage that is as Shakespearean as it is slave-driven, and it's an extended and brilliant passage that I'm going to read to you now. The reader can have little idea of the phantoms which would flit in such circumstances before the uneducated mind of the slave. Upon either side we saw grim death, assuming a variety of horrid shapes. Now it was starvation, causing us in a strange and friendless land to eat our own flesh. Now we were contending with the waves and were drowned. Now we were hunted by dogs and overtaken, and torn to pieces by their merciless fangs. We were stung by scorpions, chased by wild beasts, bitten by snakes, and worst of all, after having succeeded in swimming rivers, encountering wild beasts, sleeping in the woods, and suffering hunger, cold, heat, and nakedness, we were overtaken by hired kidnappers who, in the name of law and for the thrice cursed reward, would perchance fire upon us, kill some, wound others, and capture all. This dark picture, drawn by ignorance and fear, at times greatly shook our determination, and not unfrequently caused us to rather bear the ills we had than flee to others that we know not of. Now, this is Bible talk. This is the language of allegory. This is the vision of the runaway slave expressed in terms of a multitude of tortures and torments. You will remember my lecture on the Bible where I talked about the paratactic style, the repetition of the copula, and the repetition of forms like now, anaphora here, the way in which each sentence builds, and the sense of the journey as both a geographical narrative and as a spiritual narrative. This dark picture where all the creatures come from hell beset them. It's a vision of the Bible. It's a vision as crazed as that of, say, the Renaissance artist Hieronymus Bosch. It is a vision both real and deeply literary. And at the very end, we have Shakespeare. In that quotation from Hamlet's soliloquy, rather bear the ills we had than flee to others which we knew not of. How can the slave recall Shakespeare? Of course, this is not a transcription of the mind of the runaway slave. It is an evocation of how the biblical and the Shakespearean give shape to the texture of experience. The world of the African American slave is now filtered in Douglas's writing through canonical English high culture. What happens when he gives us the language of the African American, however, directly? In Frederick Douglass's autobiography, what we also get is the language of the American slave. He talks about the Jubilee beating, the fiddling, and the dancing. And he talks about how, at a given moment, individuals would sing. And here's a passage of poetry he gives us written in I dialect. We raise de wheat, they give us de corn. We bake de bread, they give us de crust. We sift de meal, they give us de husk. Now, what exactly is Douglass doing here? He's written I dialect. That is, he's tried to indicate forms of pronunciation by modifying conventions of spelling. And as in my subsequent lecture on African American English, we'll look in detail at the sounds of African American English and some of its grammatical features that Douglass is trying to represent. Suffice it to say here that in writing D for the definite article the, and day for they, and gib for give, Douglass is evoking certain features of African American pronunciation. And he's doing so not to mock or to show ill education, but to give us the feel of narrative. But what's at stake in this narrative? It's a bit of the African American poetic imagination. I'd like to suggest that at a moment like this, it is Douglass's attempt to give us, in effect, a black Cadman. Through repetition, through oral performance, we have a kind of Cadmonian feel to this scene, oral public poetry. Go back to my discussion of the bardic, and that at the heart of nationhood is the oral poet. Here, where do we find the oral poet in African American identity? We find that poet in the slave. And in effect, what Douglass is doing is he's giving us a narrative of slave identity. But that narrative is, as Cadman's hymn story was a narrative, a scene of eating and drinking, a scene of ritual ingestion. The husks, the water, the corn, the meal. What Douglass is showing us is that the phrasing of the African American experience is a phrasing of crust and skin and husk. Go back to that earlier image of writing in between the lines of the master's copybook. Is African American literature written in between the lines of the master's copybook? Is the African American literary experience the crust to the bread of standard English? Is it the husk? Is it only the pot liquor in which the vegetables have been boiled? Douglass is developing a series of images to describe African American linguistic as well as cultural experience. And these images of the periphery, of the interstice, of the interlinear, these are the images that he progressively dismantles to show us the centrality of African American life and the voice of cultural experience. Now, I just want to pause here for a minute, and I want to think about Douglass's work in a larger frame of African American writing, and this is something that I'm going to touch on in a subsequent lecture. But let me just call attention to it now. So much early African American writing, in particular stories of slave narratives and stories of education before Douglass, are stories about encounters with the Bible and the book. And the Harvard scholar Henry Louis Gates, Jr. has written eloquently of what he calls the trope of the talking book in African American culture. The idea that the slave somehow imagined the book talking to him, and the way in which the African American verbal sense of self was keyed to the book. Thy book and heart shall never part. This place of the book in African American culture and the place of the Bible in the narrative, not just of the slave experience, but of Douglass's experience in particular, the place of Shakespeare, that quotation as a capstone to the runaway slave's fears. All of these come together to show us in Douglass the double strain of African American literary narrative, and that is the profoundly rhetorical, public, Shakespearean, biblical, and oratorical on the one hand that we can see traced all the way through to King in the I Have a Dream speech, and on the other, the bardic, the orally performed, the dialect, and the sensual, the tactile, that we see in the slave song and that we will see transmuted through blues, jazz, rap, and hip-hop. So from Douglass, let's turn to a great contemporary, and that is Walt Whitman. Now, Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, his Leaves of Grass, that great collection of his poetry, these poems constitute for us a sense of another kind of American poetics. That is, a sense of omnivorously absorbing, or if you like, even digesting, the vocabulary of American experience and spewing it out, not in the language of the pulpit, but in the language of song. And just as Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is in so many ways a great eulogy for the dead and for the past, so Whitman's When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed is a eulogy for Lincoln. I'm going to read to you some selections from this poem that was written in 1865 to 1866. It's a very long poem, and I'm going to be reading selections from throughout. When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, and the great star early drooped in the western sky and the night, I mourned, and yet shall mourn with ever-returning spring. Ever-returning spring, Trinity sure to me you bring, lilac blooming perennial, and drooping star in the west, and thought of him I love. O powerful western falling star, O shades of night, O moody, tearful night, O great star disappeared, O the black murk that hides the star, O cruel hands that hold me, powerless, O helpless soul of me, O harsh, surrounding cloud that will not free my soul. This is the opening of the poem, and the alliteration, the emphasis, the repetitions, all of these create the feel that even though this is unrhymed, free verse, that we are in the presence of poetry. Lilacs last, this opening alliteration, the great star, the western sky, these are the images of a kind of eternal allegory of the imagination. And so what Whitman is giving us in the O's, O's, O's of repetition is the very keening sound of bardic nationalism. This is a poem not just about private power, but about public life. And let me read from another selection. Sing on, you gray-brown bird. Sing from the swamps, the recesses, pour your chant from the bushes, limitless out of the dusk, out of the cedars and pines. And Whitman concludes, to the tally of my soul, loud and strong, kept up the gray-brown bird, with pure, deliberate notes spreading, filling the night. Whitman reinvents American public discourse. He gives us sound and image, and like Lincoln, he's able to give us the impression of American public speech used for the expression of personal feeling. It is the speech of occasion and the speech of event. And I think that in many ways, our modern sense of what constitutes American public rhetoric, that is, what we say and how we say it at moments of great occasion, whether they are inaugurations, whether they are funerals, whether they are rites or rituals, these really come to us from Whitman and Lincoln. These are the idioms of 19th century culture. And it seems to me also that part of what Whitman is doing here is he is going back to that sense of the bardic. In other words, that what a culture needs is an oral poet. And if you like, the fiction of Whitman's poetry is that it is orally performed. Sing, I celebrate myself. I sing myself The verb sing is one of the central verbs of Whitman's poetry. Like Cadman's hymn, when the angel comes and says, "Sing me Frumschaft," sing to me of creation. All the poets I have read are singing of creation, whether they be the creation of a nation in the Declaration of Independence, or the creation of a self, or the creation of a racial or an ethnic identity. Everyone sings of creation. No one sang of creation in all its forms as wildly or as weirdly as Herman Melville. Melville shows us in Moby Dick not just a journey, but a linguistic experience. Indeed, we can read Moby Dick as a story of language. And even before the book begins, even before the famous "Call me Ishmael," we have many pages of prefaces, and a lot of people don't realize this about the novel, that the place that the novel begins is with Melville's scholarly front matter. And the very opening of that front matter is titled Etymology. Melville is an etymologist of the imagination. And here is the opening bit of etymology. Melville is imagining writing it in someone else's voice, and he says etymology, and he has a parenthesis supplied by a late consumptive usher to a grammar school. And so the idea here is that the etymologist is a schoolmaster, is a pedant. And, Melville writes, the pale usher, threadbare in coat, heart, body, and brain, I see him now. He was ever dusting his old lexicons and grammars with a queer handkerchief, mockingly embellished with all the gay flags of all the known nations of the world. He loved to dust his old grammars. It somehow mildly reminded him of his mortality. We have here, at the opening of Moby Dick, not the story of the sailor, but the genesis of the grammarian. We've seen philologists and lexicographers before. We've seen schoolmasters and harmless drudges. This is where Moby Dick begins. It begins in the world of the history of language. Its opening figure is not the wandering Ishmael, but the classroom philologist. Etymology is the study of all the nations. What follows this paragraph I just read to you is a set of etymologies for the word for whale, all the different Indo-European and non-European languages. It is a lexicon of the cetological. Throughout Moby Dick, there are whole passages of dictionary writing gone narrative, as if he's given us here in the novel a dusting off of old lexicons, an entire story of the whale told from the Hebrew and the Greek, all through the Latin to the Fijian language. This story of etymology is part of the larger story of American rhetoric. Go back to Mencken. The tall tale, the tall talk. There is no taller tale in American life than Moby Dick. Moby Dick is many things, but it is the ultimate fish story. And in this ultimate fish story, Melville has the ultimate fisherman, and that's Ahab. Ahab is much like the slave figure in Frederick Douglass, a creature of Shakespeare and the King James Bible. I'm going to read to you a passage from Moby Dick, a scene on the quarterdeck from chapter 36 of the novel, where Ahab argues with his lessers. And here's the paragraph. This is, if you like, a soliloquy. Ahab. Hark ye yet, again, the little lower layer. All visible objects, man, are but as pasteboard masks. But in each event, in the living act, the undoubted deed, there some unknown but still reasoning thing puts forth the moldings of its features from behind the unreasoning mask. If man will strike through the mask, how can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? To me, The white whale is that wall, shoved near to me. Sometimes I think there's naught beyond, but 'tis enough. He tasks me, he heaps me. I see in him outrageous strength, with an inscrutable malice sinewing it. That inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate. And be the white whale agent, or be the white whale principal, I will wreak that hate upon him. Talk not to me of blasphemy, man. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me. For could the sun do that, then could I do the other. What is going on here? This is, as I suggest, a kind of Shakespearean soliloquy said on the quarterdeck. Melville is showing us Ahab as a kind of Shakespearean tragic figure. He talks about images and pasteboard masks, undoubted deed. This is the language of Hamlet. Seems, madam? I know not. Seems, Hamlet says. He goes back, if you like, to a Shakespearean epistemology, to a theory of knowledge that asks, what do we see when we see the world? And do our words express what we have seen? We see these shards of Shakespeareana worked together into the great tome. And Ahab, master, if you like, of the quarterdeck, but also master of the mind, recalls that he would strike the sun if it insulted him. And what Ahab's really doing here is he's catching himself in his own metaphor. Because what he says is, you know, if the sun really could insult me, then the sun would really be like a human being. In other words, to say that the sun insults him is a form of personification, a rhetorical device in which we take an inanimate or natural object and give it human features. And so, if the sun really could insult me, I could strike it back. And so, what Melville is showing us is Ahab's literary mind at work, parsing and unpacking the images and figures that he is so manically developing here. What is Melville trying to explain to us? He's showing us Ahab as a figure of American rhetoric. He's showing us personification as one of the central features of rhetorical life. Indeed, he's written out a story of personification, and one could well argue, in conclusion of this lecture, that the story of American rhetoric and the American language really is, at heart, the story of personification. What does it mean to imagine the sun as striking you? What does it mean to imagine the Mississippi River as somehow alive? What does it mean to imagine the mountains or the waves of grain as moving like a human being? The history of language is also in some sense a personification. For when we talk about languages as living, when we talk about languages as growing, when Johnson compares the growth and morphing of language to old men who grow old and die, we are personifying language. Melville personifies language. He shows us, as Jefferson did, as all the writers I have looked at show us, that language is as much act as it is substance. For throughout Moby Dick, we see all the languages of the world. We see the argot, as it were, of the Fijian. We see the Creole of the Caribbean. We see the pidgin of the people. We see examples of language change in use and in process. In later lectures, when I look at regionalism and dialect, when I look at African American in detail, when I look at pidgins and when I look at Creoles, and when I look at theories of language itself in contemporary linguistics and in science, I'm going to call attention to so many of these things that are already encoded in the texts I've read to you in this lecture. We're moving close to the end of this set of lectures on a quest of meaning and of resonance, of personal and spiritual location. Lexicography, etymology, dialectology, and linguistic theory will all come together in this next group of lectures to get us to the point where we may see the white whale of language and, like Ahab, break through the wall.